As we approach Thanksgiving, one thing we should not be thankful for is the great abundance of terrible political analysis in the United States. In a country with free speech, everybody gets an opinion, and with that opinion, everybody has become an expert in political campaigns. The truth of the matter is, the overwhelming majority of people appearing on cable news shows talking about politics have no idea what they're talking about. Most of them have never worked on a political campaign, let alone a presidential campaign. They just don't know anything, and they can't help themselves from spouting off. So many of the reporters are young, cloistered, cliquish multimillionaires who very rarely leave the confines of the green room, the studio, or Washington, D.C. The Washington book party circuit is each of their private Camino de Santiago. It's absurd. They travel in small packs, round and round in a Washington merry-go-round, between the newsroom, the green room, and the book party room. The small circles that these people talk to repetitively say the same things every day, each week, every month, always behind, always looking at the Twitter, always being policed by the mob. What can be said out loud? What can't? One of the most amazing things to watch, being on television for so many years, was how many people immediately at the commercial break would flip over their phones to look at Twitter. How was the mob responding? Were you in lines? Were you getting the likes? I was a late adopter to Twitter. When I got on, I always tried to resist that impulse. But let me tell you, every single reporter who you see as an expert on television, the very first thing they do when it goes to commercial break, besides telling the truth with their guest, which you don't get to see, is look at their Twitter. Did they stay in line? Are they going to be yelled at? A lot of these people are no different whatsoever than the politicians. Let me ask a question. We talk about misinformation on Twitter. We talk about Hamas misinformation, Russian misinformation, Chinese misinformation, misinformation on Facebook, misinformation on social media, misinformation everywhere. But what exactly should it be called when all of America's journalists and all of America's politicians have one conversation together when the camera lights are off and another discussion entirely when the camera lights are on? Let's talk about the quiet part out loud, because you deserve to hear it. The first thing that happened yesterday was an Emerson College poll in New Hampshire. There's two parts to the poll, the Republican side and the Democratic side. And the question is, will Nikki Haley rise to challenge Donald Trump and beat him in New Hampshire? New Hampshire is a late-breaking state, and it's seen lots of races where it was supposed to go one way. Remember Barack Obama versus Hillary Clinton? And then it went completely the other way. We live in an era where polling is like Lucy and Charlie Brown with the football. Every 2 years, the polls are wrong. And every 2 years, the American people forget that. But directionally, Nikki Haley is on the move. And the key to beating Donald Trump is that he has to be beat somewhere first. Maybe that state will be New Hampshire. The Emerson poll shows on the Democratic side a wide open race. Dean Phillips is at 15, Marianne Williamson at 10, 44% undecided, with the incumbent president at 27%. My analysis of that is Dean Phillips will win the New Hampshire primary. But the biggest news in American politics isn't within the two parties. It's what's happening outside of the two-party system. It makes sense, but in Washington and New York newsrooms, everybody goes on along as usual, pretending this isn't happening. There are a few reporters, people like Jonathan Martin, who understand what's happening and have the guts to write about it fearlessly, truthfully, honestly. What's happening is a great crack up. The system that produced President Trump and is producing, if you listen to the conventional wisdom of the American media, a rematch that 80% of the American people don't want. Well, the people are responding to it. And they're breaking the system that gave them Donald Trump, that gave them the choice that they don't seem to like. And so right now, Robert Kennedy, a conspiracy theorist, is at 25% in the national polls. Let me be clear about what that number means. If you're at 25%, you can get to 30%. And if you're at 30%, you can get to 35%. During Trump's rise, I remember sitting on so many sets, and everybody would come on and they would say, Donald Trump can't get past 20%. And I remember saying, why? Why can't he get past 20%? It was the physics and the logic of the green room. And then it was, he couldn't get past 30%. And then it was, he couldn't get past 40, and then 50. And then it was, even after he secured the delegates for the nomination, he wouldn't be the nominee. It would be a brokered convention. It was all delusional. And in the end, not only was he the nominee, but he went on to become the worst president in American history. So here we go again. Now, the first consequence for somebody who is in a third-party position at 30% of the vote is this. It expands the number of states dramatically. The 5-state competitive electoral college race that we've gotten used to over the last election cycles will be gone. It won't come down to 3 states and under 50,000 votes. It will come down to a race between 30 to 40%, a plurality election that takes place over 40 competitive swing states. And that's before Joe Manchin gets into the race. Let's watch a second or two of Joe Manchin being interviewed by Caitlin Collins at CNN.
You're going to leave the Democratic Party?
Well, you know, I don't know if I've never considered myself a Washington Democrat. I've been a very independent person, and I don't really think that should have.
That sounds like you're leaving.
Well, no, you have a D or an R by your name or an I by your name. It shouldn't identify who you are. If you change who you are because you change, you have a D, then you have an R, or you have an I, people go back and forth. It's more for the person's political, I think, than more for who the person is. No matter what I have by me, I'm an independent thinking. I vote independently, and I've always done that for 40 years. So we'll see.
If you were to identify the single largest group of voters in America, you could easily classify them as the exhausted majority. That's what the exhausted majority is. Exhausted. Joe Manchin is on to something, but his words are not precise. His sentiments are loose. There's no tightness in his message. There's no core conviction other than a geography of the center that has no meaning, that has no definition. But he has a sentiment that will catch on and people will like, because what he's hinting around, sketching around, digging around at the end of the day is a feeling of loss, of normalcy. 100 years ago in 1920, a return to normalcy was actually Warren Harding's election slogan. What Joe Manchin is hinting around at is a return to normalcy, the reinvigoration of a center. Not so much a political center, but the type of center that Tennyson talked about. Things fall apart. The center will not hold. What Joe Manchin is talking about is a center of American life, a gravity of cooperation, an impulse towards collaboration, a concept of patriotism that says we're all in this together. The tearing apart of society, the impulse towards faction, all of these things are what George Washington warned about in his farewell address. These issues are coming to the front. They're being pushed forward because in government of the people, by the people, for the people, when the political class says, we don't listen to you anymore, what results from that is the type of political chaos we're beginning to see. Now, Joe Manchin is making an interesting argument about President Biden. I don't think this argument holds water, but it is believed by millions of people. And it's that Joe Biden has somehow become a reckless left-wing ideologue, that it's Joe Biden's policies that are responsible for the chaos in the streets of San Francisco. I don't think that's true, but millions believe it. And the attack is coming from a moderate Democrat, a member of the U.S. Senate, who is retiring from the state of West Virginia. And there's a question at hand that rises from that. What happened between Joe Biden and Joe Manchin? How did these two men who knew each other for so long, in 3 short years, develop such enmity? How did an alliance so long in the making completely crack up? Who's responsible for that? Was it a White House staff mistake? Was there some effrontery? A broken promise? What is the matter in the relationship between Senator Manchin and President Biden? It's curious. And the American people should get a better handle on it. Because the dissolution of that relationship will profoundly color the race ahead if Joe Biden and Donald Trump were to be the party's nominees, which, as I've said often, is not predestined and, in fact, not something that I think will happen. But it is something that the American media thinks will happen, because the American media is closed-minded and backward-looking, not forward-looking. They can't see what's coming around the curve because they have blinders on, and they don't even have the guts to say the quiet part out loud. The truth of the matter is I've been really hard on Bret Baier because he was terrified of the Fox audience telling them that Joe Biden won the election. But the simple truth is all the newsrooms are filled with Bret Baier, aren't they? Because nobody will say the quiet part out loud. Everybody allows the politicians, when the camera lights go on, to say whatever they want. The gaslighting goes on. And then the condemnation comes. How dare anyone practice democracy? Right, Casey Hunt? But I do have this question for you. Did David Zasloff consult with the Urban League when he laid off thousands and thousands of people in your company? Did David Zasloff consult with the Urban League before he fired Don Lemon? A cheap shot's a cheap shot. And what Casey Hunt did was throw a couple cheap shots. But that's the way of the American media. Cloistered, cliquish, insolent, and belligerent when it comes to the concepts of American democracy.